Right. Well, I'd like to say welcome to everyone. Welcome to today's panel at 1 o'clock with our three creators. My name is David Holden, and I'm going to be your moderator today. And I'm going to just try to stay out of the way and just let them talk and answer your questions. But what I want to do is just introduce each of them one by one. So I'm going to start off with the gentleman to my left, your right, known to the comics world as Batt. Worked at Top Cow in the 90s on books like Cyberforce and a title that he co-created called Ascension. He's worked on titles such as New Avengers, Thor, Superman, Batman, and multiple Green Lantern titles. Would you all join me in welcoming Matt Bannon?
Good afternoon.
Right on. And to my immediate right here, best known for inking Young Justice and Teen Titans Go, he's also had amazing runs on Wolverine, Iron Man, and hundreds of titles for Marvel, DC, and Image. And recently he has been devoting his time to his nonprofit. And I'd like to introduce Lary Stucker.
Everybody.
All right. And finally, to my far right, right after high school, super impressive, right after high school was one of the youngest creators there at the beginning of Image Comics. Over the years, he has worked on titles such as Spider-Man, Bloodstrike, Superman, Black Panther, Witchblade, Wolverine. He's also directed television and animated shows. And I'd like to introduce Dan Fraga.
Hello, hello, hello.
This panel is open to all topics as it relates to the comic industry, and we definitely want to get your voices in the room. I just want to ask kind of an opening question to our creators, and then just open it up to you all for questions, if that's okay. So I guess the first question is just, could you tell us each a little bit about just how you got into the industry? We'll start off with you, Dan.
Oh, okay. Well, I was a kid. And I grew up on a chicken farm, and we didn't have a lot of money. And I spent a lot of time in my head and my imagination. And I was fortunate enough when I was about 9, I helped this guy out at a garage sale. And he gave me my pick of these things on this table. And one of them was this radio that picked up television signals. So while I was doing my farm chores, I would listen to cartoons. And I started having these cartoons in my head. Which helped sort of develop my imagination, and it led to me finding comics. And I went to my first comic convention in 1988, where I went to go meet Stan Lee, and I brought a bunch of my drawings to show Stan Lee, and my line, the line for Stan went so long it went into Artist Alley, and that's where I met a guy named Eric Larson. And Eric, creator of the Savage Dragon, one of the 7 Image founders, drew Spider-Man, the Punisher, the Hulk, a very talented guy. I showed him my work while I was in line, and he asked me what I did for a living. I said, I'm 14. I work at a pizza place. And he said, I hope you're good at making pizzas because you'll never draw comics. So this alarm went off in my mind, not unlike the sound you hear in Kill Bill. And I said, oh, really? So I made it my mission to prove him wrong. So 4 years later, well, I met Rob Liefeld the year after, and we became friends. And he told me he was going to start a company with Eric and Todd. Eventually it became Image Comics. I got hired in December of 91, and I had graduated high school in June of that year. Then Image launched. Savage Dragon came out, sold 750,000 copies. Oh my goodness. And then in May of 93, Bloodstrike, my first comic, came out, and it sold 1 million. So I called Eric and said, ha! Not bad for a guy who was never supposed to be drawing comics. But ultimately, the main reason I got into it is because I have a lot of stories and things in my mind, and I love storytelling. I love making people happy, and it basically originated from the thrill. It's that feeling, and everybody gets it from something. But I remember reading a comic, and whenever it was something good, like a John Byrne or Arthur Adams or George Perez or something like that, it gave me this intense satisfaction that is hard to explain. And I realized it came from exciting storytelling. So I felt like if I could learn how to do that and give that to people, it would be a good thing. And I've been making a living doing that ever since.
Right on. Let's go to you, Larry.
So when Dan first started telling that story, I was thinking of The Office, and suddenly I'm awake. And then, but no, there's a lot of detail to that, which is awesome. I loved to draw as a kid, and I obviously gravitated to comics because of that. And so I saw myself working somehow in the arts. And school always had a hard time with that. They would always say like, "Oh, we'll be an architect then." And it turned out architecture was nothing like drawing comic books or anything fun. So I was going to go through school and try to figure out the right path. As like I was going to be a doctor. That doctor seems like a cool job. Yeah, and I worked at a little martial art supply store and had a lot of downtime, and so I would draw while I was in there. Yeah, Musashi Martial Arts in Stanton, California, if you happen to be by there. And so I'm drawing this character, and these guys come up, and this guy goes, "Oh, that's pretty cool. That's me." I go, "What are you talking about?" And I look up, and it's this like big muscular guy, and he's like, "Yeah, I play Chapel. I get hired out to be Chapel at comic book conventions." And I'm like, "Really?" He goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Are you going to be a comic book artist?" And I go, "That's a thing? Like you can do that for a living?" And then all these like bells went off, and I'm like, "I'm going to do that." So I put together this very rudimentary set of drawings, mostly of Image comic book characters, and I brought them down to show my work. And I went to a couple of Marvel and DC editors for portfolio reviews, and they opened it up, and I think they were probably really bothered by all this Image Comics that was in there. And they're like, "Yeah, no, this isn't going to work." And I'm like, "Oh, all right." And so I kept going, and the Image booth, the Image section was crazy. There was this huge line that wrapped out of the building and stuff. This is at Comic-Con before it was like not Comic-Con.
In San Diego.
Yeah,
right?
in San Diego, yeah. And so I finally got in, and my mom talked to Valentino, and he like got my portfolio and he gave it to Dan and said, "Hey, look at this stuff." And Dan was so kind. The funny thing about Dan is he will spend time with anybody, and he will share insights and wisdom. And even at the like old age of, what were you, 20 or 19? Yeah, was still full of that. And so he gave me tips, and he's like, "You should ink, like you should be an inker." And I went, "Okay, like that's what I'll do, I'll ink." And so I started down that path, and he gave me some pencil photocopies of work for me to practice inking on. And I did that a couple of times, was able to show my work to some people, art to bear, and a fake art as well, which was a great fun story.
It was Byron.
Yeah, it was Byron, yeah. I just went into a studio and I said like, "Hey," I found out that Art to Bear was the head inker at Extreme Studios, and
Art is famous for doing the X-Men and over Wilson Pertasio and Jim Lee, X-Men 269, very famous rogue issue.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Big time guy.
Yeah, so I went in to ask if he could review my work. I just went into the studio, and just some kid walked into the studio, asked for art. So someone else came out pretending to be art, and I didn't know any difference, but they critiqued my work and helped me get better because of that critique. And so shortly after that, like probably 3 months later, I came in with new work that had gotten better, and Rob gave me my first break doing background inking for Danny Mickey and a couple other guys, and that led me down that path.
Amazing.
The rest is history, some kind of history.
Right on. And Matt Banning, what about you? How did you kind of get into comics?
Well, my path originally, I wanted to go to NASA and build rockets. So I drew rockets and planes and battleships and things like that. And then around the age of 13, I became best friends with my buddy Mike, and he introduced me to this whole idea of collecting comics. like I had read comics, I enjoyed Spider-Man and his amazing friends and whatnot, but the idea of like collecting them and keeping them in bags and all of that kind of thing, that wasn't on my radar yet. And so through my friendship with him, we challenged each other eventually to see who could draw the better comic book, because we both drew. And I did my own version of the Fantastic Four and basically just never stopped. Won the contest with my buddy, and he went on to become a doctor, and I eventually found myself at the Kubert School in New Jersey, where, if you're not familiar with the Kubert School, it's one of the few places in North America, if not on the planet, you can actually be taught by comic book professionals in a fully recognized school. And so from there I learned from people like Bart Sears and Mark Pennington and Tex Blaisdell, who's an old name that goes all the way back to Little Orphan Annie. So I learned from a lot of different people. And I was an okay student. I wasn't the king of my classes, but I just recognized I was going to have to work a little bit harder. And so in between my first and second year, I had a big jump happen in my work that summer. So when I came back and started showing my inking samples specifically to my teachers from first year and my new teachers, some of my teachers were like, you get a couple more pieces together and you're ready to go. You're ready to start taking interviews and stuff. And so with that encouragement, finished up the last couple pieces, and a couple of my instructors actually gave me their editor's phone numbers. So I gave Mike Carlin up at DC a call, and I was like, hey, I'm coming up to see Dan Raspler at 2:30. You mind if I see you at 2 o'clock? And he was like, yeah, sure, I'll see you at 2. And so then I called Dan Raspler and was like, hey, I'm seeing Mike Carlin at 2 o'clock. Can I see you at 2:30? And basically I actually ended up with the full DC editorial phone list. And I just went down and basically said, I had like 5 or 6 appointments. And so eventually the day arrived and I show up in the office and go in. And Mike Carlin, if you don't know, he's the editor of The Death of Superman. And so he was editing all the Superman stuff at this time. And so kind of nervous, Superman's kind of a big deal. And so I take my stuff in, expecting him to kind of pat me on the head and be like, good job, keep it up, and we'll see you next time you come up. But he looks through it again, and he goes, you're a Kubert School guy, aren't you? And he nailed me because I had, great presentation in my portfolio, because that's one of the things that they teach us. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, well, how would you like a job as assistant inker on Superman? And I was like, yeah, that sounds awesome. I think I'll do that. So I picked up that gig, and so I was the assistant inker on Superman for the Panic in the Sky storyline, which is the storyline right before Death of Superman started. And so I took the rest of my meetings, and Dan Raspler and Dan Thorsland actually paid me to do more samples. They didn't have anything at the time, but they wanted to encourage me to improve, and DC had kind of funds set aside for that, so they actually paid me samples, and I tried out for Wonder Woman over, she became a big name eventually. What's her name? I think she last did work with Warren Ellis, but anyway. So they paid me to do samples, and so basically I wasn't learning a lot at Kubert School at that point. Mostly learning in my painting classes, because they had some teachers quit going into second year and they weren't able to fill the positions that well. And so I lasted the rest of my first semester at Kubert School, and I asked them to have the rest of my tuition ready for me on the last day, and I was like, let's go for it. And basically, ever since then, I haven't done anything else. There were some lean times, sure, but, I started getting work on the Punisher from Marvel, picked up my first full gig from DC, which was Legion 92, and And then a few years after that, Mark Silvestri and Top Cow tapped me and asked me to come down and try out for them. And Top Cow is really where I made my name. And inked whatever I could get my hands on at Top Cow.
Right on. Do any of you in the audience have any questions about any aspect of the comics industry, like, breaking in, improving your craft, anything like that? I just want to make sure we get all your voices in the room. Okay, well, we'll go here and then we'll go over here. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, basically when I pencil something, it's really hard to keep it from getting really smudgy, and sometimes when it gets really smudgy, it gets like it's hard to keep going just because it looks so smudgy and it's hard to want to finish it. And I was just wondering if y'all have any advice on that and just how to keep your pieces from getting a little bit less smudgy.
Any tips on anti-smudge? Dan, you want to take it?
There's several ways you can go about it. Number one, the material you're using, it sounds like you're using a softer lead. So if you're using like a number 2 pencil, that's an HB, which has a little bit of smearing. If you go up, as you go to an H, there's 2 sides. H is hard, B is soft. So if you get a 1H, which is just an H, it's a little harder. 2H is a little harder. 2Hs almost don't smear at all. There's also something you can buy for your hand. It's a glove that basically only has the pinky finger and the rest exposed, called a smudge guard. So you can use that. And then there's also a technique that I learned from Top Cow. My friend Mike Turner taught me this, and I believe Silvestri taught him. It's to have a kneaded eraser, those gray erasers. So if you draw something really loose, you could take that kneaded eraser, don't erase, but pat it. It will pull all the lead out, but you'll still see your underdrawing. And then you go darker, and then you pat it out, and then you keep patting it until you get to that more resolved thing, and then you tighten up your pencils from there. But yeah, no problem.
Wow, that's awesome. I mean, getting some tips from pros in the industry, right? People pay money for that. That's awesome. Let's go right here.
What's sort of the difference between working for Marvel and DC versus an Image project? Just like
Right. Good question.
the process creatively, things like that.
Larry, you want to take that?
For me, I would say it's typically when you get paid. That's the biggest difference. I mean, the paper is mostly the same. The art teams that you're working with are typically the same as well too. Early on, like DC work would go from the penciler to a letterer, and then it would come to the inker. So when I would get it, I would already have all the word bubbles and stuff on. But then over time, that all changed, and everyone kind of followed the same pattern there. So scripts would get done. I think Marvel, for the longest time, scripts would be finished last, right? Like you'd have loose scripts as a penciler.
The Marvel style was usually like an outline, and you, as a penciler, fleshed it out. And I'd say for me, even working for Image, working for different studios, I've worked for Extreme, I've worked for Wildstorm, I've worked for Top Cow. Even those are different because of basically the procedural nature of, like Larry mentioned, how you get paid. Like at Marvel in the old days, it would be through invoicing. Similarly with DC, but it was just a different way of invoicing. Marvel and DC were a little more established and a little more machine-like in the way of doing it. But as far as, everything else, yeah, somebody pencils it, somebody inks it, somebody colors it, sort of.
What about the time to publishing, though? So the weirdest thing about going from Image Comics to Marvel or DC Comics was that at Image Comics you would work on something and like a week or 2 weeks later it would be in the comic book store. Yes. And at Marvel and DC it was 3 months. Yeah. So that was you were flying by the seat of your pants at Extreme anyhow. We were like just cramming to get stuff out by the deadlines.
Mm-hmm. Matt, do you have a perspective on that, working for the different studios?
Well, yeah, like I've always found working for Marvel and DC, kind of like Dan alluded to, they're more established companies. And so therefore our roles and our jobs are, more confining at times. like, it's not typical for inkers to have opinions in this business. But that, I've never paid attention to that. And so like at Top Cow and at the image companies like Wildstorm and stuff that I've worked with, generally, if I have an opinion about something, which is generally about making the project we're working on better, I always feel more free to share it and actually be able to have a discussion about it. Where at Marvel and DC, they're basically more like, you're an inker, just be quiet and ink. So for me, that's one of the big differences I found between the two. Yeah, like, because DC and Marvel don't recognize the fact that I've been an art director and an editor in this business as well. They're just like, you're an inker. So what could I know about publishing comics after 3 decades of top 10 books?
Yeah, you know what? Well, say a little bit more about that because, you know, you had mentioned in our conversation in the other room that in addition to inking, you've been, like you said, an art director, an editor, and everything like that. Tell us just a little bit about what that role, like being an editor. What is that like? I don't know. I know everyone knows about writing or conceptually knows about writing and drawing and inking and things like that. But what's the editorial process like?
Well, the editorial process was a lot of fun. Like one of the things when I got into the business is I wanted to do as many of the jobs as I could, because so then I could understand the business better. And so, yeah, like when my editor tells me we need to get a book out, I'll fully understand when the time is we really need to get the book out and things like that. And editing was great because basically I was in on the initial story meetings where we're deciding where the next storyline is going to go before the writer gets started. So, yeah, we'd have the initial meeting, kind of decide where we were going to go, hear what the writer is thinking, and then send him to write off the full story synopsis so we can start getting scripts going to get the penciler going. And usually the script process would take about a week or so, hopefully. Sometimes it would be we would be working out the further end of the story a little bit more, but we needed to get the penciler started possibly because the deadline's tight already, so we got to get them the first 5 to 10 pages at least so we can get things rolling. And one of the things my guys benefited from is like if the book fell behind, obviously, I would jump in and ink a couple pages. And luckily for me, I was editing actually David Finch on his first regular monthly book, Cyberforce. And when it was put in our hands, the book was totally behind, and Top Cow had decided they were going to do, what was it? What did we call it? Well, they had done shipping guarantees. So these books had to be in the stores at certain times, and looking at our schedule for the first few issues, we only had like 3.5, maybe 4 weeks per issue. And so it was a scramble, and so, you know, I would buy David presents when he would hit deadlines and stuff, because we were under the gun, and because David and I were friends, I knew how to kind of motivate him and keep him in. And yeah, and then like we had Jason Gorder inking, and he was able to stay on top of Dave's stuff, which was great. And one of the things I kind of regret is our colorist. He'd come on, and one of the first things he colored was a huge double-page spread. And it was, and I walked into the computer room and I looked, and I had to tell him at that moment, dude, I know you're almost done, but that's a night scene. And he had done it like it was noon. And it was a big spaceship over ice floes. And so I was like, yeah, I'm sorry, dude, but we got to redo that, or you just got to darken everything. Do something.
Oh, man.
But I enjoyed the editing process. When I was editing, one of the things I did to help keep our books on time is I actually instituted on my book the old DC production schedule. Doing monthly books for DC, they don't do it now, but when I started, there was a weekly check-in. And basically, if you didn't have the number of pages done, you'd basically have the next week to follow it up, to catch up and get the next week's pages done. But if you couldn't do that, they would start to pull pages because they don't want to risk the book missing shipping. And so that's one of the things I instituted on Cyberforce right away. So then, because with the deadlines we had, we couldn't go a couple weeks without check-ins. It had to be every week. And yeah, that's one of the things I did to keep the book on track. And
Okay. So it sounds like a lot about project management.
definitely.
Okay.
Does pulling pages mean assigning those to a different artist, or does that mean shortening the comic book?
That means assigning them to a different artist.
Yeah, because if you were to pull them out, then the story probably wouldn't make any sense,
Yeah,
right?
you can, right. That's why I was like, how do you pull pages from a story?
Right. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just going on that process, I'm more of a comic book reader and appreciator than, doing it. But I've always been curious how the scenes get picked in the overarching story. Like, how do you pick out which one to put an image to and the script to?
Okay. So like the artist will get the scripts, is that, well, yeah, and it sounds like earlier you were saying that sometimes you just get like a plot outline, you don't even get a full script.
Yeah, basically, from Marvel, you get, for a 22-page comic, sometimes it could be as few as 3 pages of type stuff that, Wolverine, it gets a letter at the X Mansion and gets on a plane and goes to Madripoor. When he gets there, he's greeted by this guy. They drive to the Foxy Den where he runs into the Viper. And, that's basically like how it is. And then, so that goes for a few pages and you go, well, okay, as an artist, you kind of almost work as sort of a movie director at that point, and you say, well, what's the important part? What's the part that's most exciting to the reader, at least from my point of view? And you expand upon those. I'm a very visual guy, so I'll expand big scenes. Like seeing Viper for the first time, I might give her half a page, where another guy might just give her a headshot, that sort of thing. DC Comics is full script, and it's very, very prescriptive. Panel 1, high angle shot, like the writer is telling you what to do. But as far as dialing it all the way back from a writing perspective, some of the stuff that I did for Mattel, like I had kind of Matt's job at Mattel. I worked on Monster High and Ever After High, and we did all the animated stuff. So if you go on Netflix, we did like Boo York and things like that. And we're given a directive from the toy part of the company, and they have these new products, and they want a 90-minute story to reflect that. So we'll ideate and create an outline. And as far as where the scenes go, it's to facilitate the story, and usually there's a lot of templates like Hero's Journey and things like Luke Skywalker did the Campbell Hero's Journey, and where you put them setting-wise is usually something that serves the scene best. So, you wouldn't put someone who's challenged with something in something that isn't challenging to them, or, in a lot of cases, you might even change a setting because it works better. Like, I'm directing a show right now for Disney Junior, and I'm trying not to be specific because it's not announced yet. But they said in the beginning, oh yeah, we might move this from the outside to inside, right? And the whole scene had taken place outside, but the inside facilitated something better and more challenging for the story, even though it was the same story. So it's really about the heart of the story itself, and also how to make it the most exciting for the audience side of it. Yeah.
Right on. Other questions? Yes, please.
It seems like everyone has a very interesting resume, but I know every day was not easy. So for the people who are in your audience, what advice would you give them for those days that wasn't easy for your careers?
If I would go to Larry, this is right up his alley.
Yeah, I think that. So a couple of things. Number one, don't be your own worst enemy in that, because it is hard. There are sacrifices that you make, but making sure to do things like make your deadlines. That's a huge one, right? Like if editors have to pull pages from you, they don't forget that, right? And that's a big deal. So making sure that you hit your deadlines, making sure that you don't flake and get distracted by social media or other things that can just take you off of what your goals are. I think that's a huge part is if you have goals in mind and you're working towards them, don't let those other things be a distraction. I think that's a big one for sure. And the other is to like make sure that you have balance in the work that you do and what you want and what reality sets in. Like maybe you can't do this work full time, but you can devote a part of your free time to it in order to continue to grow that piece and see if it catches fire. There's a writer I like. His name's Nissan Taleb, and he talks a lot about the world that we live in is so different. If you're a baker, you can only bake so many loaves of bread a day. If you're a dentist, you can only drill so many sets of teeth. But if you're in these scalable jobs like being an artist or being a musician or something like that, the amount of work you put in could suddenly explode and scale. But it also means that there's a lot of losers in that and a very few number of winners. So I try to play in that space of scalable, but then also have the reality of the things that help make sure that I'm, taking care of my family and being able to make payments on stuff, like that sort of thing. That's right.
And to piggyback on what you're saying, somebody had said something about they say, and I love it, inspiration is for amateurs, right? Like what makes you a pro is doing it the days you don't feel like doing it. That's what makes a professional is making it through the days you're not feeling that muse. You have to do it and pushing through it. That's the difference.
Does that answer your question? Yeah. Larry, you just mentioned about meeting. Oh, Larry, you had just mentioned about meeting deadlines, and can you just educate us a little bit more on what that process is like? Primarily, you're best known as an inker. You're definitely an artist in a variety of manners, but as an inker, how many pages would be average per week or something like that?
Yeah, so I was considered a pretty fast inker. So I was doing 2 pages a day, but that was 2 pages a day with 12 to 16-hour days, and also would depend on the penciler I was working with. So some people like to fill every single aspect of their page, like Dan sometimes, and then others would have creative use of white space, and maybe depending on deadlines, Dan would have more creative use of white space than others.
Do shortcuts.
But like people like Steve Scroce, like when we did that Wolverine run, I absolutely loved those pages and dreaded how long it was going to take me to do those. You have 100 ninjas coming at, Wolverine shattering through glass, and every shard of glass is flying at you. You go, that's beautiful, and I'm going to spend the next day and a half on that page. So yeah, there was a lot of that. So you had to pace yourself.
I always because I get a lot of grief.
Hold on.
I get a lot of grief for how detailed my stuff is. Like I'll hear, "Oh man, I feel bad for your colorist," or "Oh man, your inker is gonna hate you," and I go, "Man, I had to draw this." You know what I mean? Like it's not like I said, "Here, man, take some punishment." No, my brain said to do this.
But if the deadline for the book is May 30th, and you finished on May 18th, then that's where it would become a challenge. Is that part is the farther down you are in the production process, the tighter the deadline gets for you.
So during the production process, is it generally either the script has been done or at least an outline has been done, and then it goes to who? next? The penciler?
Penciler, yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's weird too, that process is different depending on the writer you work with. So the last comic that I had done before I left comics for about 14 years. So 16 years. It was no, my math is terrible. It was
It's a little while.
it was a while. I left, and the last book I had done was Black Panther, and I received the outline, and this is 2002. I reached out to the writer through email, and he wouldn't write me back. And I said, well, I just want your phone number because I want to ask you some questions. And he told the editor, tell Dan not to reach out to me. He has the script, tell him to just draw it. And I thought, man, that doesn't feel collaborative or anything like that. So I left comics, I went and work in Hollywood, and we do things called table reads, where we go through the script and kind of every department is there to kind of understand and have questions about what's going on. So when I did He-Man and the Masters of the Multiverse, that's my son trying to call me. When I did He-Man and Masters of the Multiverse, I worked with a guy named Tim Seeley, and he was entirely open to discussion. You know, we would read a scene, and I'm like, well, when He-Man is doing this, what about this? And wouldn't it be cool if this? And we would have like a nice discussion, and it felt very collaborative. So when I went to the page, I felt like a very kind of holographic idea of what the thing was supposed to be. So I guess the short version of it is it varies from writer to writer, you know?
Well, let me, now again, if there are any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. But what I want to do is throw a question over here to Matt. Dan was just talking about one of his favorite collaborations. What are some of your favorite collaborations? Sometimes we'll see a writer, a penciler, an inker, like a team, just work on books over and over and over again, and they just have this definitive look. Are there any particular collaborations you've been really excited about?
Well, I had the good fortune to work with Mark Silvestri on Darkness, and I was there during the development process on it. And one of I would say my biggest contribution to the Darkness was the fact that Garth Ennis was a friend of mine from when I first broke into the business. We both broke in at DC around the same time, and I lived in Manhattan at the time, and he was there around the same time, and so we became friends during that time period. And actually, I ended up meeting the whole big chunk of the British and Irish creators, which I had always looked up to, and you know, they were always much cooler than I even anticipated that they would be. And so when Darkness came along, Mark didn't have a writer yet. He had been developing it all on his own. And I immediately started pushing for Garth. But Garth Ennis had just started doing Preacher at this point and hadn't caught fire yet. Word of mouth was starting. So to Mark, Garth was like, who's Garth Ennis? Who cares? And so kind of kept at him, and David Wohl, who was editor-in-chief at the time, started kind of backing me up. And so we got Garth to do the script for Medieval Spawn Witchblade. And when that came in and Mark went into his office and read it, he came out of his office like half hour, 45 minutes later, and just walked into David's office where I was sitting. It was like, we've got to get Garth to do the Darkness. And so that was a great collaboration there. And so the Darkness to me is always a special project, because other than getting to work with Mark, I also got to work with Garth as well. And you guys know Garth now because of The Boys and all of the other things that he's been doing. And obviously, anyone who knows my career, David Finch and I just can't stay away from each other. We go off and do our own things for a while, but time always brings us back together, and it's always wonderful. And sometimes you collaborate with another creator and magic happens. And so when Dave and I work together, yes, it may be time consuming doing the pages, but it's not hard doing the pages. And yeah, so those are probably two of my biggest collaborations that have stood the test of time, really.
Right on. Oh, yeah, question.
Yeah, so I'm just really curious. I mean, there's so much talent in all the processes, your pencils to inks to color. How do the egos, there's gotta be egos, there's gotta be. So just give us a dish, tell us. But, you know, how does that work?
I'll actually say something. I think probably the most tamest thing to say about this. I'm gonna, because I'll try to be careful. So you know, yes, definitely lots of egos, and also too, there's this weird thing. It's a scarcity product, right? There's only so many books that are being made, and so there's this weird positioning that can happen, and part of it is like ego. The other part is just, hey, this is what I'm doing for a living. I want to be able to continue doing this. So I want to be on the best books. I want to be, you know, on a regular series. A regular series is gold to an artist. And so there's this constant like weirdness that can come into play, especially with people who you're really good friends with. You know, you make great friends with people in the industry and you're kind of like, oh, we're great friends, and he's on that book? Gosh, I wish I was on that book. Like, there's this weird thing that happens. And so for me, like, it's always been an issue of where does my faith take me in the work that I do, and just putting trust in God and how he takes care of me. So whether I'm on a book that I really like or a book that I'm like, oh, this is paying the bills, like, okay, cool. I can, like, you know, be part of that process and be happy for my friends and others that are on amazing books and producing amazing things that I get to be inspired by.
Did you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I think people with the big egos, usually the word spreads fast about them, and usually those guys, if they're in the position of hiring, they offset their egos with paying you more. You know, that's one of the things I've learned is, like, you know, you have to eat more crud with their ego, but you're getting paid more. I tend to avoid those people because, you know, I'm very principled, and I try not to have as much ego as I can in any situation. I too, like Larry, roll with Jesus, you know, and I try to be as good as I can to other people. But I've encountered many people that just don't care, and what ends up happening is either I up my rate or I don't do the gig.
What about handing your stuff off? Somebody, is it just a trust that you've built with this, so you know this?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, like, my favorite inker to work with is Larry. I tell him that all the time. I've worked with a lot of the best. Never work with Matt. I would love to one day, you know, but generally speaking, the only time I ever ran into somebody, and I don't know if it's ego or whatever it was, but I was working on an issue of Spider-Man, and the inker who I had no choice in getting called me up and was telling me, hey, I fixed your trees, and I fixed the way you drew this guy's shoes, and shoes don't look like that. And he called me to tell me that he was fixing my work, and I did not like that call because I drew it the way I wanted to draw it. It was a choice. I didn't draw it. He just felt that way, and I said to my editor, please don't ever let me work with this guy again.
On the other side of that, there is a certain level where inkers will bring a particular style into work that should be complementary, but you'll find things like, you changed my rocks is one that I remember quite well, which was hilarious.
Okay, let me give you backstory. All right, so no, it was literally the absolute very first thing I'd ever done, and it was one of the first things that this inker, very talented inker by the name of Danny Mickey, one of the very first things he ever had done. And my pencils are notoriously very tight. Like, you could print from my pencils because I draw the way I draw because that's the way I draw. And I got it back, and the first thing I noticed was that he changed my rocks. So I said, dude, you changed my rocks. So it's, that was 1992, okay?
Lots changed since then.
Did you have a question?
I was just curious if you would share, like, there's the joke that Rob Liefeld can't draw feet very well. Do each of you have your own thing that you would prefer not to draw or avoid or struggle with?
Likenesses and lettering.
Yeah, I would agree with likenesses and feet. I'd still say feet.
drawing feet.
I know you do. Yeah.
Is there anything that you don't
Uh,
like to draw?
yeah, like definitely with you on the likenesses. It takes a while to get that going. Well, let's see. Don't like to draw. Well, I think I'm done with guys in tactical gear for a while. I've done enough of those books, starting with The Punisher back in '92, that, yeah, I kind of get bored with the flak jackets and the body armor and all that.
Keeping it consistent from panel to panel is kind of an issue too. If you've got like 40
There's so much
pouches-
stuff on them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
You can't
Wasn't-
keep track of how much stuff is on them panel to panel.
Just have some pouches.
That was the most difficult part of drawing He-Man is I worked for Mattel, I stopped working for Mattel, then it did a He-Man comic, and they have a committee that will review this stuff, and it has to be on model. So every angle, when I had to draw Space Skeletor, this thing had all these things on it, and if it wasn't right, they'd say, "Hey, man, that bolt isn't in the right place." And you're like, "No one cares."
Yeah.
They care.
They care.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got a question right here.
I was wondering which piece of art you're proudest of in your entire career? 'Cause there's thousands of drawings and inking. Which one did you just leave everything on the page?
The cover of Black Flag #1, the triple gatefold.
Oh, you knew right away.
I know. I finished it Halloween night, 1994. It's a giant triple gatefold, and it is in Eugene, Oregon, on the wall of Will Perdomo. I know exactly where it is. Yeah.
Larry, what about you?
That's actually that's a hard one. I would probably say it's the Wolverine double page spread, him busting into a room filled with ninjas. And ninjas with machine guns, I think, which is an odd thing, but yeah, that one was fantastic. I remember I loved that piece. It's very fun. I have no idea where that piece is. I think Steve has it, but yeah.
I actually have a couple. The first for me would be probably the cover for Spawn #25, because that marks where I officially take over inking Mark, and also became art director in charge of inking at Top Cow. Yeah, that cover. Well, and also working on Spawn, because one thing people don't really know about Todd is Todd actually lived on Vancouver Island in British Columbia for a significant amount of time. And I actually grew up on Vancouver Island, an hour away from him. I never met Todd during that time, but just knowing he was just down the island highway from me was a lot of inspiration. It was like, oh, a Canadian can make it. Can be a big name in this business. And that's the time when he was doing his amazing Spider-Man stuff. Well, or all the Spider-Man stuff. And probably the piece you probably all know the best is probably the Batman black and white piece.
That's the one.
And that was an important piece for me because I had set a milestone for myself when I got into the business that I wanted to have made a significant contribution to Batman by the time I was 25. And I actually did that piece 2 weeks before my 25th birthday.
Nice. That Ascension cover was pretty awesome too, though.
Yeah, the Ascension gatefold cover, I was thinking as well.
I know a lot of us inkers had that on our desks as inspiration.
The Batman in the Batcave sitting.
yeah, like that was the first time when I really received a lot of accolades from my peers. Like Stephen Platt said to me, he was like, dude, I saw it and time stopped. And I was like, what?
He heard Dreamweaver playing. Doo, Dreamweaver.
Yeah, because literally I got that piece one afternoon and I had to have it done the next morning. So that was like a quick 14, 16-hour turnaround for me. And literally at 9 a.m., Top Cow's calling, are you done yet? You done yet? You done yet? For the next 3 or 4 hours as I'm trying to like fill the blacks in and wrap it up.
Do we have, I thought we had another question. Okay, right there.
Were there any storylines that you guys got to work on that you just got so excited about just the story and how it was gonna be?
I have, and it also was a giant disappointment because 9/11 had just happened, and Marvel had completely reined back their policies. It was one that Larry and I had worked on, another one with Wolverine and a lot of ninjas, and I had received the script. There were two things that had happened. One, they said Wolverine doesn't smoke anymore. And instead of saying to me, hey, can you redraw these without the cigar, they just whited them out. So Wolverine's sitting around going like this. That bothered me. But the one where I got the script and it's like he's with Ogun and they get attacked by ninjas and they have to defeat all the ninjas. I'm like, ninja fight. Oh man, I'm going to do my best Frank Miller on this thing. And I got all these ideas. And then my editor said, oh, you can't show slicing. You can't show stabbing. You can't show blood. You can't show this. And I was like, but it's a fight with Wolverine, Ogun, and ninjas, man. And so it was like I had to draw it as a bunch of silhouettes, and it was like, sort of implying stuff happened, and then they're standing around a bunch of like ninjas on the floor, and I just thought, man, that was the coolest thing I never got to do.
Did you have a response to that one?
I really enjoyed the Young Justice run. That was a long run, but it was just fun. There were fun stories. They impacted a lot of kids growing up during that period of time. And just the creative team, there was a lot of collaboration and just a lot of good times within that whole process.
And you were working with one of your good friends, one of your best friends.
Oh yeah.
On that.
Yeah, Todd and I go way back.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Matt.
Yeah, like for me, actually, one of my more recent books that I worked on, the concept for Superman, Wonder Woman, when it was pitched to me, I actually really bought into it because in the land of comics, we do a lot of retread. Stories that feel familiar with a little bit of a different spin or whatever. Where the Superman, Wonder Woman idea was like, yeah, there's like one or two obscure issues through fandom where they dated or something, but there's never actually been a story where they seriously dated and explored the idea of them dating. Because it always kind of made sense to me that people of that power level might be attracted to each other because they're having a hard time finding people to relate to. So the concept of that, I bought into it, and then like Tony Daniel and I really made a push to make sure that both characters' canons were available so it wouldn't be a Brave and the Bold Adventure of the Month kind of book. Wanted it to have a little bit more resonance with the characters themselves. And yeah, because initially too, like fandom, there was a lot of negative reaction because there was an assumption Wonder Woman was going to be the number 2 in the book, which we really went out of our way to not have happen. And actually, she spends the first few issues teaching Superman how to fight because he's been powered up his whole life and doesn't actually know how to fist fight. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. And it was fresh. So, and even though I guess in the multiverse it exists somewhere. I'm very happy to have done the first year of that book.
Right on. We're getting close to our time being over here, but earlier today I had a brief conversation with Larry, and I know one of the things that he enjoys talking about is just giving some advice to people who are interested in getting into the business or improving their craft. Larry, do you want to just kind of close this out with just a couple of words for people?
I feel weird saying this next to Dan because I think Dan's the one who champions this the most, is just to draw every day. Take some time. If this is what you want to do, then you need to keep putting that time in. And there are some people who have just incredible talent. There are talented people in the world, and then there are people who have skills, and those skills have been developed over thousands of hours of just putting the work in. And so I put myself in the skills category of just thousands of hours of putting the time in. And so that's what I would recommend, is just keep putting the time in. And you'll get it for sure. There's some leaps you can make. Getting conversations with amazing artists that you like and learning from them and being open to hear what they have to say, and then observing the world around you, because there's nothing better than looking at the way the real world translates into the art world is another big part of that.
Right on. I think we had one last question there. I want to get another voice in the room.
So I'm primarily a digital artist, and I was just wondering if you feel like there's now more of a market for digital artists as far as comic books, or is it still mostly traditional?
You have a smudge guard on. Can you put your hand up? That's the smudge guard I was telling you about. Oh, okay. Right on. Right on. Oh, you got that. Great. I think digital is awesome. I mean, I draw everything I do on my book right now in Procreate, but I also I've been a collector of art my entire career, and even before when I was an aspiring person, and I like having an archive. I have sketches by Frank Frazetta and John Byrne, and it feels awesome that it was in their hands. And so I do what they call tradigital, which is we, pencil it out on the iPad and Procreate, export it out in blue, physically ink it on a board, and then bring it back in and color it. But if there's a new dawn and a new day with NFTs and such, as far as having something of value in that way, but digital, I think, is the way, because it moves a lot faster. You can, nowhere else, back in the day, even when I started doing storyboards, it was, I pencil it, I ink it, I erase it, I scan it, I clean it up, then I deliver it. But with Procreate, or if you use Clip, I don't know what you use, you can create brushes that mimic what you're doing in the real world. There's no smudging. And there's so many things, the thing, because I go back and forth, there's little funny things I do, sometimes when I'm drawing physically, I'll Apple Z on my desk, and I can't, and then conversely I will erase something in Procreate and dust off shavings that don't exist. But I do like, I have pinch and zoomed my physical artwork. It would drive me crazy sometimes. Everything works, but the head size is wrong, and it's a perfectly drawn face. And I go, I have to erase that and redraw it, and it's so good. Where in Procreate, I could just lasso it and bring it up and down. But to answer your question, I think there's room for both, and I feel like there's advantages to both. But it's, I guess, preference. But as far as today's world of social media, you can draw something, export it out as a JPEG, a PNG, or whatever you want, and put it right up on Instagram or wherever you want. Yeah.
Everyone, first of all, thank you very much for being here. I just want to honor their time and let them get back to the rest of their day. But thank you all for joining us. Let's give our creators one more round of applause, please. Thank you.